This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to this special episode of Powers and Principalities. As you may have noticed, you're actually hearing the intro music for Evangelical, because this episode is also being released in that feed as well. This episode is being published on January 6th, 2022, the one-year anniversary of the failed coup attempt where President Trump's supporters, brandishing real weapons alongside the symbolic weaponry of Christian nationalism draped in the cultural trappings of white evangelicalism, sought to overthrow the results of a secure and fair election. To mark this occasion, I had a conversation with my friend and frequent guest, Chrissy Stroop. We talk about the long lead up to the Trump administration, as well as the insurrection. We also talk about what has happened since, the prescience of fellow Irreverent Media podcaster Bradley Onishi's New York Times op-ed piece in January 2021 about how the failed coup attempt would become Trump's own version of the lost cause, and also how we can continue to have better conversations about Christianity's influence and impact on our media and politics. This interview was recorded on Zoom on January 5th, 2022, and is essentially live to tape. I hope you all are out there doing everything you can to take care of yourselves and those in your orbit as Omicron circulates. Evangelical and Powers and Principalities are productions of the Post-Evangelical Post. You can support my work directly at postevangelicalpost.com at either $4, $6, or $8 a month levels. 25% of funds are donated each month to organizations that help populations harmed by white evangelicalism. You can learn more at postevangelicalpost.com. And if you're an independent podcaster or content creator out there listening to this and you're struggling with the ethics of asking for funding, like I just did, just remember that the seditious traitor, Josh Hawley, sent a fundraising email during the Capitol Riot. And then maybe take it easy on yourself. Because if he can do something like that, you can add a little tag asking for people to support you directly. All right, everybody, let's get into it. Hello and welcome to this special episode of Powers and Principalities, noting the inauspicious anniversary of January 6th. I have with me as my guest Chrissy Stroop, who is a friend of mine and a frequent guest on the show. Chrissy is a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches and columnist for Open Democracy. Chrissy, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Blake. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back. We talked a little bit about our respective holidays and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are at the beginning of a new year and just getting settled. And just like last year, even just the sort of anniversary of what happened on January 6th was already sort of starting to loom over this year as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, last year, definitely a lot of things were brewing. They had that. That was technically wasn't last year. It was technically late 2020, right? December 2020 was the Jericho March, emceed by good old Eric Metaxas.
That's right.
Who, made jokes about violence against the press, I think it was. Nice guy.
Yeah. Very class act. Very much a class act. Also known for punching a bystander.
Right. After the Republican National Convention.
And running away. Yes. Noted brave person, Eric Metaxas.
He bravely ran away. Well, he did actually punch the protester first. I guess that's more than Sir Robin ever did.
If you get the Monty Python reference, then good. Well, actually, one of the things when I was thinking about talking to you today and really trying to frame what's happened since January 6th, it actually made me think about how we actually spoke for the first time on Evangelical the day before the 2016 election, and just thinking about how much the country has changed since then. And in most ways, not for the better. obviously the last 2 years of dealing with a pandemic, but even that, the sort of steady erosion of a lot of the safeguards and norms of democracy.
Mhm.
Let's, even before we get to the insurrection, what are your thoughts, and what are some of the things from the Trump era that really stand out to you as enabling the
Mhm.
insurrection itself to happen, and
Mhm.
what the sort of damages that are um, still present in the democratic institutions here in America are?
Mhm. Sure. Well, you talked about the erosion of democracy, which I guess there is a process that could be referred to as erosion, but also I think a lot of it is more like demolition or taking a battering ram to it, trying to get these institutions to break.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, that's something that Trump uh, did constantly throughout his presidency. And it's something that, white evangelicals and Trump supporters in general have become increasingly comfortable with doing openly.
Mm-hmm.
So these norms aren't just, fraying by themselves due to lack of use, but they're being deliberately pushed against, and the institutions are being tested. And so, yeah, and this didn't start with Trump, and it doesn't end with Trump. We're in
Right.
a reactionary moment that Trump was able to embody and ride, sort of weirdly enough, in 2016, 2015 to 2016. But it's not even just a US thing. I mean, globally, we're in this moment of sort of surging right wing populism.
Mm-hmm.
We've been in it since about 2011 or so. I'm thinking of Pussy Riot and Putin starting to crack down, really ramping that up in 2012 in Russia. Thinking about how the Christian right in America and the far right in Europe have embraced Putin's Christian leadership as they see it. And because I'm me, I'm going to say correctly, of course, he is a Christian and he is leading in an authoritarian Christian way, right? And the Orthodox Church has become increasingly close to him. Over this period, we've seen Franklin Graham in 2015, for example, meet with the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, and get himself declared by Patriarch Kirill, despite being a Protestant and therefore a heretic, supposedly. Patriarch Kirill declares Graham to be a confessor of the faith because they're both anti-gay Christians together. So isn't that great?
Mm-hmm.
I wrote an essay about not just about that, but also about Pat Buchanan's embrace of Russian neoconservatism and Russian Christian nationalism, which has this sort of weirdly international flair to it, right? Because it's all about supposedly national sovereignty against these supposedly, colonizing Western values.
Mm-hmm.
But this anti-globalist movement is also globalist or global anyway. So yeah, it's been happening worldwide. It's been happening at home. The Christian right, as we know it today, as they don't have to tell you, really kind of crystallized with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Obviously, institutions were being built in the 70s and 60s, Christian schools, the Heritage Foundation,
Right.
that sort of stuff.
Yeah. On that note,
The moral
notably,
majority.
mm-hmm, and notably,
But
the year of the evangelical was 1976. According to
and
Newsweek.
right. And then, 4 years later, they elect a president who isn't one of them, but, endorses them sort of literally, if kind of half tongue in cheek, right? The whole,
right.
You can't endorse me, but I endorse you.
Yep.
Reagan was actually very charming. It's quite insidious that he was so charming and so able to disarm his political opponents with humor, because really he's pretty much as extreme of a nationalist as Trump. And Trump even rehashed a bunch of Reaganite stuff, but
including Make
like
America
the slogan,
Great Again.
"Make America Great Again."
Yep.
So we were on this trajectory. At least the Christian right was on this trajectory maybe since the 1970s. and well, definitely since the 1970s. And Trump was, I think, a logical culmination of it. They wanted to have as much power as possible. They ramped it up. They ramped up the pressure in the organization more in recent years, particularly since 2015, with the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court legalizing same-sex marriage, when they felt like they were losing power. And then a couple of years later, into the Trump presidency, we see Southern Baptists, numbers, actually raw members, church membership numbers falling for the first time. And we start to then see white evangelicals declining precipitously as a percentage of the American population, partly due to immigration and other factors. There's not, as many people leaving as maybe I would like to see, but still they're a very small percentage of the population now, which does also mean there's more evangelicals of color, which is a complicated thing. They sometimes vote the same way, but not always, But white conservative Christians, they feel like they're losing, quote unquote, their America, the quote, real America, And so in our country, that's what's driving this fierce right-wing backlash against human rights and civil rights gains, and against social justice in a more for an inclusion of more of the population.
Mm-hmm. Right, and to your point, like, this is not the as a lot of folks have been saying over the last several years, the Trump administration was not an aberration, but rather the culmination of a lot of work on the part of these far-right individuals over the work of decades, including those that are Christian, that are evangelical. And I'm curious, when we look at the events of January 6th, and we look at the footage, and we look at what was done, what are some of the striking examples of what is now generally called Christian nationalism? Mm-hmm. And I think that's an apt term. But I do think also that the way in which we talk about these things is important, and also noting that essentially Christian nationalism it can be identified as separate, or maybe as distinct within white evangelicalism, but white evangelicalism is a particular, very strong carrier of that particular virus, yes, if you will.
But what's interesting, I mean, with white evangelicals is that, the more often they go to church, the more likely they are to support Donald Trump. Right. And I think when we talk about Christian nationalism and how some people are Christian nationalists without being regular churchgoers, we lose mm-hmm. sight of that. So that's important, because church doesn't automatically, church attendance doesn't translate into good character, right? Or, well, it depends on your definition of good character, because right. obviously they think tearing down the American institutions so that they can be in charge is the good thing to do. But anyway, so to kind of get at your question, I want to bring up the Jericho March again, and mm-hmm. The shofars and the singing and this invocation of a trope from what Christians call the Old Testament, and using that in a very Christian way, right? Jews relate to the Tanakh very differently than Christians do, mm-hmm. but we often see Christians who have a sort of what I call a politics of providentialism. That is, you look for signs, or you look for callings from God, and you look to world events, current events, history, for evidence of what God wants you to do. And then you invoke all of these biblical tropes. And probably everyone who's listening to this podcast has heard, of Trump being the new King Cyrus, supposedly, right? Mm-hmm. That's one trope that was used a lot, right? The Persian king that allowed the exiled Jews to return to their homeland, and so protected them. Trump was represented as that by certain strands of prophetic evangelical Christianity, and in particularly in charismatic traditions, as this kind of protector figure, divinely appointed, divinely ordained. And so they invoke these stories from the Hebrew scriptures. And when you're invoking Jericho, you're invoking divinely ordained conquest, right? And you march symbolically around the Capitol 7 times and you blow shofars and that sort of thing. And what they were doing with that was essentially claiming that God was going to conquer that territory for them, because they were in the right. They're God's people in a way that Antifa and liberals and MSNBC watchers are not, or CNN watchers,
Or Fox watchers, if you,
according to those who only watch like OAN, yes.
Yes.
Right. So you have all this charismatic Christian stuff, and I don't mean that in the in the sense that I would say like Ronald Reagan was a charismatic figure. I mean, the prophecies, the tongues, the prayer walks, the weird prayers, all of that sort of stuff. And we see a lot of that again on 1/6. We see shofar blowers. We see people singing hymns and claiming divine power to overturn the election. I mean, Paula White did that, right at the very top, obviously insulated from everything. But people were doing that just, there in the mall or the area around the Capitol, around the the Senate, that some of them were storming. All of this Christian stuff was going on. Christian flags were carried. Did you grow up saying the pledge to the Christian flag?
I did not. I was a public school kid, so I did not do that, but I definitely know people in my immediate circle that went to Christian schools and pledged to the Christian flag. I did just this fall see a Christian flag being flown from the back of a pickup truck here in the Chicago suburbs, which was a first. I had never seen that. Was just this fall.
Was it accompanied by a Trump flag or a thin blue line flag or an American flag? Or
actually, this one was a solo flag. I didn't really inspect to see if there were any other bumper stickers or anything like that.
Interesting.
But yeah, it was striking because it is a loaded symbol, especially in this day and age when it's a signifier that you essentially are a Christian nationalist. I don't think it started with that intent, but that is in the context of 2020 to 2022 United States.
It was actually adopted by the more ecumenical Protestants in the 1940s, the group that became the National Council of Churches, the group that is like too liberal and too nice for like the National Association of Evangelicals, right? And there's two versions of the pledge. Like the more mainline version ends with some nice stuff about brotherhood, but the version that is widely said in American Christian schools each day after you pledge the American flag ends with one Savior, crucified, risen, and coming again with life and liberty for all who believe. All who believe, not all, just all who believe.
That's an important qualifier.
No brotherhood. Only if you believe. So yeah, there were Christian flags. There was one iconic picture from January 6th. And I think there were 3 flags on the flagpole. I'm trying to remember, but I think one was, the police, like thin blue line flag. And then the one at the top of the flagpole, if I remember correctly, was a God country Notre Dame flag. So Indiana represent, I guess.
Yeah.
And maybe the other one was an American flag, maybe, but I'll have to look that up because now I want to.
Yeah.
Anyway, there were these things that the Proud Boys got together beforehand and filmed, and so we all saw it. This very evangelical prayer, like they prayed in a way that would be 100% recognizable to anyone who grew up in evangelical subculture before they stormed the Capitol.
Yeah,
we saw the QAnon shaman's prayer in the Senate, which was a little out there, but still, more evangelical than not, I guess. Though obviously, all the evangelicals I know would look askance at somebody calling themselves a shaman.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. But nonetheless, as you've cataloged, there were a lot of examples of evangelicalism and Christian nationalism on display, and I think that is one of the things that becomes difficult when you're trying to discuss these things to a broad audience, which is that you it's hard to be able to distinguish and say, yes, we need to talk about Christian nationalism, but we need to also talk about it within the context of white evangelicalism and these fundamentalist, very conservative communities that have particular beliefs and practices and rituals and political actions that contribute to this type of willingness to show up and try to overthrow the government.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I Googled that picture because it was bothering me. I found it. So there's 3 flags on one flagpole. It's actually the lowest one, that's God Country Notre Dame. Then there's a police flag. Then there's the American flag at the top of the flagpole. So that's the one that I was thinking of, but couldn't quite remember what the 3rd flag was or the order of the flags.
Yeah, maybe as the year goes on, the order changes. Like if once you get close to the college football,
the bowl games,
championship series,
God Country Notre Dame goes at the top.
Yeah.
I mean, Notre Dame fans, they do take their college football seriously. But it's interesting that we see Notre Dame there. I mean, where did Amy Coney Barrett come from? South Bend, Notre Dame's law school. Now, I just was recently at a conference at Notre Dame. There's a lot of great people at Notre Dame. They're far and away not all Amy Coney Barrett. It's a pretty nice place. But it's very interesting to, she gets shoved onto the Supreme Court. And, then we see Notre Dame specifically represented at the 1/6 insurrection. Just an interesting connection.
It is a very, very interesting. I want to also talk about a piece from our friend Bradley Onishi that was published in the New York Times just a couple weeks after the insurrection. And the title of that op-ed was called Trump's New Civil Religion. And in that piece, he essentially argues what I believe has come to pass, which is that this event, the insurrection, has taken essentially a mythic type of quality that's not based in the reality of the events that happened on January 6th, 2021, and essentially have become this a form of like the lost cause, and that was developed in the South following the South's loss in the Civil War. Just to quote briefly from it, then we can talk about it. He has Onishi writes, "A myth becomes a reality through ritual when its story is dramatized and its adherents brought to collective participation in it. When Trump supporters took hold of the Capitol, temporarily halting the counting of the Electoral College votes, they brought the fiction down upon the levers of government through temporary mob rule." I'm just curious what your thoughts are on looking back at the remainder of 2021 and seeing the ways in which even very, very mainstream, very popular conservative talking heads like Tucker Carlson have bought into this, or to the degree that they are willing to actively develop this type of mythology as a way to undermine future elections.
I would say they absolutely have. And it's interesting too, again, that certain figures, including Tucker Carlson and, Rod Dreher, the obnoxious, raving convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, have gone to Hungary to show their support for Viktor Orban, who is, an anti-democratic, essentially would-be dictator there. He's president of the country of Hungary, and he has been taking it in a very anti-democratic direction. He's another example of this global surge of right-wing populism. Right. And, Roddy Boy and Tucker showed up to say, this is what America should be like, authoritarian Hungary. But yeah, I think Onishi is really spot on when he talks about the construction of myths, how they're divorced from reality, and the staying power has been really something. I mean, we've had a year of voter suppression laws passed at the state level and complete impotence of the Biden administration and Congress to do anything about that federally to pass federal voter protections. But they've continued to claim the election is stolen. They're not really they're they're not really backing away from that. Um, and we see it reflected in some other things that characterize the Trump supporting demographics. You think about all of white evangelicals, and they are the one religious demographic with the highest rate of vaccine refusal at still, I think, about a quarter. So, and we just learned that those who go to church more often, for those that go to church more often, that goes up to, I think it was about 30% or maybe a little more. So with evangelicals, church attendance correlates with Trump support, correlates with vaccine refusal. And Brad, in his article, brought in QAnon, talking about an eschatology based on conspiracy, the eschatology of MAGAism, which obviously many white evangelicals have found somehow perfectly compatible with their style of thinking and with their own, end times views that may be distinct and separate from that. But there is this idea that Trump is going to return and set things straight, right? Like a return of the king sort of thing, or, like a microcosm of Jesus coming back.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, that is, it is, even now, it's sort of hard for me to put into words how frustrating that is, because we do see, and it makes me think of the different media sort of environments that we all exist in simultaneously, because this sort of narrative can use the same imagery, but in radically different ways than what was presented on MSNBC or elsewhere, because this imagery does fit into that very, very deep-seated religious impulse, especially within groups like evangelicals, to see persecution everywhere, even though they are the ones that are, and they literally stormed the Capitol in order to try to overthrow a peaceful transition of power. Like Trump, they're bullies who see themselves as the victims, thus justifying their bullying, and there's no basis in reality for that self-representation. And I think that's one reason that we see just so many, sort of disturbing psychological symptoms among them, because this kind of repression is not a healthy thing, right? This kind of cognitive dissonance. So it just kind of explodes in just complete weird divorce from reality sort of stuff. And that's nothing new in evangelicalism. I mean, and maybe you can speak to this too, but one of my family's like longtime family friends, going back to my parents' time in college, he is, very much an evangelical Christian. And also he's always like believed in alien conspiracy theories and the Illuminati, like those things all coexist perfectly naturally for him. And I mean, what they all do, I think, is help to represent him in his mind as, first of all, someone who has some kind of secret knowledge that you're not supposed to have, which is always like seductive. But also they give your life sort of structure and meaning. And if you're frustrated in life, you have something to blame. And QAnon is sort of the same thing. And as many others like Megan Goodwin have pointed out, it's also just Satanic Panic 2.0. I mean, these tropes about adrenochrome, about what liberals are supposedly doing to babies. They're just, 1980s Satanic Panic kind of stuff, a little bit repackaged. Yeah. I mean, and that to me is sort of, whenever you do study these things, or whether it's personally or academically, you recognize that much of what white evangelicalism panics over this isn't the first time Like this has happened
Right.
demonstrably multiple times in history, as you said.
And why do they panic over things that aren't real? Because that keeps them from focusing on the very real problems in their own communities. So child abuse is real. And you take the Satanic Panic, right? And you're precisely in a time when child abuse was being widely talked about for roughly the first time. I mean, it was something that doctors began to notice and be shocked by in the 1940s. In the 1940s and 1950s, talk about these horrific X-rays that, clearly these wounds had to be inflicted by someone. These kinds of things that they were looking at didn't just happen, right? They were clearly seeing evidence of violence against these children, evidence of child abuse. This was something that was not talked about. They start talking about it. There's a little bit of efforts to address it in the 1960s and then more in the 1970s. And, then you have this huge moral panic that posits a huge conspiracy and misdirects your energies toward targets and scapegoats who are not at the root of the problem, so you don't have to deal with the problem in your own community. I mean, as now is very well established, most incidences of child sex abuse, violence against children, they're carried out by people who are in the family or close to the family, right? So focus on the family. Well, there you go. And we've also been seeing in recent years just how much abuse has been tolerated and covered up in white evangelical churches and so forth. And honestly, I think it's related to the sort of white woman's bargain of the Old South, where men had their dalliances, which actually is a euphemism for more than just affairs, but they raped their female slaves, and the women sort of looked the other way. I mean, their wives, right? Their white wives sort of just looked the other way. There's lots of generational trauma here in various ways. And when I think about what fundamentalism is defined psychologically, and there's many ways we could define it, historically, anthropologically, but to me, what fundamentalism is psychologically is a misdirected response to trauma perpetuated communally and generationally. And when I tried to say that these unhealthy sorts of repression lead to these kinds of like pathological symptoms, this is what I mean. The Satanic Panic, I think, comes from a very profound state of just unease, of not being well. You want to deal with problems, but you can't deal with the actual problem. It's too much of an ego threat. So you deal with the conspiracy instead.
Right. Which I do, and I do understand sort of the impulse there. I certainly, as a person, can sometimes I can approach a complex problem through abstraction or through a story. But it's something that it's not necessarily, it's not attributing blame and then building an entire theology on top of it. But at the same time, even something being understandable does not excuse it. And so I understanding that how a mechanism of reaction works is different than justifying it.
Absolutely, it's not justifiable whatsoever.
Right.
I mean, what people in these communities need to do is to be willing to look inward and be self-reflective. But the entire theological approach of evangelicalism is designed to make that basically impossible.
Right. And that is a very interesting point, as far as how whenever you take something that is essentially an internal issue, like as you said, and a misdirected response to trauma, and then externalize it through attributing it to supernatural action on the part of demons or something else, then you're not, at least within the context that I know of white evangelicalism, that can often mean that it justifies your own bad actions, or it redirects your attention to somewhere else that doesn't allow you to address the problem. in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, and evangelicalism is constantly giving people enemies and causes and things to direct their focus and their energies toward, so they don't direct it inward, and is also constantly telling people you can't trust your feelings, you can't trust your doubts, the heart is deceitful above all things, lean not on your own understanding. I mean, and those last two are quotes from the Bible. They're particularly popular among evangelicals and interpreted in this way, right? They're essentially taught to self gaslight.
Yeah, and if it happens early enough, then you actually have a hard time developing your own sense of self, your own sense of understanding of your own wants and needs. And that's why it's laughable that so many evangelicals over the past year have been trying to use phrases like doubt your doubts before you deconstruct to try to undermine some of the popular conversations that are happening online around deconstruction.
I am, of course, thinking of our old friend Tim Keller / Darth Vader tweeting, it's Satan who whispers, trust yourself, right? God whispers, trust me, or something like that, right?
Yeah, I'm sure. That doesn't, that's sure.
He's a quirky one. He's not John Piper, but he's a quirky one.
Yeah. And, this is a very, this is what we've been talking about for the last 5 or 10 minutes is, definitely a very sort of fraught thing and can't all be summed up in a single conversation. So just to sort of disclaim anything from that, as far as in the last 5 or 10 minutes, like we've been talking a lot about some very serious things. So, and I appreciate just being able to even talk about it sort of extemporaneously like this. I want to return back to some of the other things instead of some of the broad parts of, some of these broad aspects of fundamentalism that we talked about since we started talking about Satanic Panic and that being sort of a historical antecedent to this. Around that same time, in the 80s and everything else is really, I think, when all of these financial and cultural investments that really white evangelicals had been pouring into their own communities since the 1880s really started to pay off, within politically. And ever since that period, essentially for our, as being, Oregon Trail generation people, or Zennials or whatever the hell you want to call us.
Yeah, I'm actually recording this in Oregon, and I have not died of snake bite.
Yes. Did you know anybody that died of dysentery on your way, though?
I'll have to do contact tracing to let you know.
That's a very, very particular joke. You would, sure. I don't need to explain it. Anyways, since the 80s was when things really started to pay off politically, and our entire lives have really been dictated by and large by the political desires of evangelicals. They've been very successful, and even if it's not white evangelicals, sure, conservatives who evangelicals align with and work alongside, we can broaden it to that degree. But when it comes to the sort of things that we do, which is talk about religion in the public sphere, I started to believe and started to use this phrase in around March of last year, which is trying to talk about the end of this white evangelical hegemony that they've sort of imposed on the media and have very successfully done politically as well, as being sort of the default type of American Christian. I think we're starting to see that, but I'm curious, like what especially after this last year, and on this anniversary of January 6th, what is your impression as far as the way in which we as a society are able to talk about religion in general and Christianity in America in particular?
Well, clearly you look not just at demographics, but also at public opinion on things like universal health care, Medicare for all, on racial justice and rights for sexual and gender minorities and all these sorts of things. And if you just look at that, absolutely, white Christian cultural hegemony is in decline. So this is a real thing that, white conservative Christians have noticed and are panicking about and responding very badly to, but they are responding to something. Most of the country's over them. So they're clearly losing their hegemony in that sense. Most of the country doesn't defer to them, doesn't respect them. But unfortunately, they still are able to wield very disproportionate power politically because of things like the Electoral College, the continuing effects of gerrymandering, though that's been overturned in a couple of places, voter suppression, of which we've just seen a brand new wave that nothing is going to be done about before the 2022 and 2024 elections. That's going to be disastrous. And we're letting them get away with disenfranchising mostly Black voters and some other minority voters, particularly in southern states. So all of these things, and just the fundamental structure of the Senate as equal representation. So there's a lot of states with very little population that have a lot of pull, right? Doesn't Wyoming have like more antelope than people in it, but it still has 2 senators?
Yeah, I think they have around 800,000 people in the entire state, which even smaller metropolitan areas can challenge that population size.
So, I think we're starting to see many people, well, I don't want to say we, who's we. I think maybe for the first time, a lot of white people have noticed just how fundamentally unfair our political structures are. And they were designed that way, right? To protect power for, white, wealthy male landowners. The Constitution was indeed a document for and by slave owners. Sure, some of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery, but at the end of the day, they compromised. And hey, I like Hamilton as much as anybody else. It's a pretty great musical. But, the whole romantic notion that we have of the founding fathers is pretty problematic. I think Hamilton actually does help destabilize that. I mean, it's much better than 1776, but okay, that's a distraction. Sorry, I go down rabbit trails. And I just kind of lost my train of thought.
No, yeah. So you were talking a bit about
right, the disproportionate power that white conservative Christians still hold. It is structurally built into certain things that just desperately need reform. We need to make DC a state. We need to abolish the Electoral College, and we need national voting protections. None of which is forthcoming anytime soon. But then there's the other thing with respect to white Christian cultural hegemony is that, the media still protects it, still just absolutely mishandles how they deal with toxic authoritarian Christianity, even after all the Trump years, after a year of Biden being obstructed, a year out from the January 6th insurrection. It is deeply disappointing to me how just unquestioned, unrecognized Christian hegemony, Christian supremacism pervades the elite media discourse, the punditocracy, the legacy media, the elite public sphere. And I know that you and I have been working to help ex-evangelicals get more media representation. We've made some gains in recent years, but it's not a lot compared to just the overwhelming way in which in the press, religious values are still taken to be inherently good things. And by that, they mean, some kind of like, some sort of mishmash of Christianity, like vague Christianity, right? We say religion in the media. A lot of times what they really mean is Christianity. Religion is too big of a category to be meaningful and should not be used that way. But prominent pundits do it all the time. Jennifer Rubin very recently, said, well, religious values are kindness and empathy and, all these sorts of things. So this hatred toward immigrants from the Trump people is unreligious. Well, no, it's not. I mean, that's not how anything works. Religious values is a contextual category. Their religious values include cultural dominance over everybody else. That's a value. It's a religious value. It's a Christian value.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And and to further elaborate on that, one example is it's literally in the name dominion theology. The 7 mountains, whatever sort of version of dominionist theology you want to have, and its presence in very influential things like Christian Reconstruction, who our mutual friend Julie Ingersoll is an expert in. These things are apparent, but they really can sometimes only feel apparent if you have a passing familiarity with them. And I do know that, and I think what you are talking about in regards to there being this general sort of respect for religiosity, it really defaults to what used to be called Judeo-Christian values, right? I think
sure, and sometimes also still is in the press,
right? Though there are Jewish scholars and Jewish individuals and Jewish writers who have very effectively pushed back against that.
Yeah, of course it shouldn't be used, but that doesn't mean that the press isn't doing it. I believe the term was coined back in the 19th century, but in my mind it's more of a Cold War term, where they were actually making an effort, the people who were using it at the time, to be more inclusive, but in so doing they subsumed Judaism to Christianity essentially, and they kind of reinforced Christian notions of supersessionism. Even though this was the more liberal version of sort of 50s and 60s civil religion. It was the sorry about the doors and the dog. The dog has just gotten back from a walk. My roommate has brought the dog back.
That's totally fine. We embrace pet sounds. It's not just a good Beach Boys album. It's background noise on podcasts. It's okay.
Yeah, this is pandemic life, right? So
that's right.
Anyway,
yeah.
I lost my train of thought again because it's a dog.
Yeah, no, you were talking about the phrase Judeo-Christian and how it was supposed to be a inclusive term, but
sure,
over time.
But it was also part of this Cold War initiative, of civil society leaders, business leaders, government leaders getting together and trying to promote religion, because they thought that we needed religious values to be able to oppose godless communism, right? So we're still very much in the analysis of someone like Jennifer Rubin, we're still seeing basically this Cold War way of thinking. And we're seeing a huge panic in the press about secularization, right? And one of the things that is very frustrating to me is they never seem to want to talk to any of the secularizing. I mean, they don't talk to former adherents of Christian faiths, right? To say, how do you feel about secularization? You're one of these nuns we've been hearing about, NONES. You're one of these religiously unaffiliated. Maybe instead of talking to another pastor who will talk about how sad and scary secularization is, because in the secular future, no one will do humanitarian things, which, just as an aside, is complete bullshit. Maybe we'll also talk to you, Mr. or Ms. Secularized person, and we'll just get your opinion. But they don't care. That's continuing Christian cultural hegemony,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean it's certainly not a it's not a cut and dry sort of thing to try to challenge something that has been present in society for centuries. But I mean, to your point, I do think that some of the things that have been happening over the last several years, whether it's through social media and the rise of communities sort of forming ad hoc communities online, not just things like Exvangelical, which we have both contributed to, or Empty the Pews, which you use to highlight those stories of people who have left and identify as having left specifically. There's also things like ex-Mormon, ex-Muslim, like these sorts of pushes are valuable, and I think that even though it's not as sort of reaching the same level of representation in legacy media or the media that has a lot of weight, cultural weight behind it, or even the capacity to say, adequately pay people to create that content. And I'm still encouraged, nonetheless.
Even I, consummate pessimist, am somewhat encouraged that we have made progress. The conversations are happening. Sometimes they get some press coverage, and eventually they're going to have to, be more well known and more heard. Because the dams are breaking, I guess.
And to that degree, I do sort of see, we're starting to see at least these things play out even within evangelicalism. With the ways in which some more strident white evangelical leaders are trying to push back against breakthrough books like Jesus and John Wayne, and trying to discredit those writers and those perspectives. Same thing with Beth Allison Barr's book, which is directed towards a Christian audience, and questions some of the sacred cows, to just use that that turn of phrase.
And I gotta say, I just have a lot of respect for both Kristen Cobes-Dumay and Beth Allison Barr. And her book was The Making of Biblical Womanhood. Looking at that historically, but also taking on the theology to some extent of biblical patriarchy or male headship, complementarianism, whatever you want to call it. But what I want to say is less about the book and more just about how I just appreciate her so much for actually listening to me and people like me. She doesn't seem to feel particularly threatened by the fact that I just decided I just want nothing to do with any of this. Like, I don't want to be a Christian. I don't want to be religious. She's still nice to me. That means something.
yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And I think there's value in those conversations happening in multiple places from multiple perspectives. Like that conversation needs to happen within the church. I think I think that this sort of show represents the people that have had those conversations before and had to leave for whatever those reasons were.
And I mean, honestly, I still don't think that the church, like evangelical churches, are ever going to really reform. I just don't believe they're reformable.
No, and I don't think they want to. Not
those who are still in charge of them. They sure don't want to.
Oh, not at all. They've had so many chances. They've given themselves so many mulligans. To quote Ralph Reed. So
I mean, the fruits of these books within the Christian groups that they're maybe to some extent targeted at, I would argue that Jesus and John Wayne was written for a much wider audience in theory, but these are books written by evangelical scholars, liberal to progressive evangelical scholars, and certainly read by other evangelical audiences. The fruits of that is going to be just more people leaving, because once again, the churches won't change. The evangelical institutions, evangelical colleges, they won't change. The National Association of Evangelicals won't change. The CCCU won't change. They don't change.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, they're, I think you had a piece several years ago about where do ex-evangelicals come from, and it's like, this is where they come from. They come from these types of conflicts. Like they try to change, they push out reformers. That's what they've done for decades. It's not that the church doesn't need reform, it doesn't want reform.
And then the ones who think they're all fancy celebrate Reformation Day and drink their favorite beers and think they're all cool and whatnot. But yeah. They can't reform anything. They can't reform their way out of a paper box. Paper bag, cardboard box, whatever.
Yeah. Well, to sort of wrap things up, I do want to pick your brain about where you think the next year will sort of lead us. Where I'm going to publish this. We're talking on January 5th. Come hell or high water, this is going to be published on the 6th with minimal editing. But with that in mind, what are your thoughts as far as where these conversations are going, what we might reasonably expect from 2022? And like I dragged myself on Instagram earlier just on January 1st. I don't make resolutions or predictions anymore because I thought I was really clever on January 2020 and was like citing a quote from like the Watchmen HBO limited series, and it was like, you can't heal with a mask on. And so at the beginning of 2020 I said, here's to more healing and fewer masks, and that really shot me in the foot. So I mean, yeah, as grandiose or as specific or small as you want, what are you going to be looking out for? What are your thoughts for the political and religious landscape here in the U.S. Next year, next couple of years?
Well, I don't want to say that the House and Senate are definitely lost to Democrats, but I think they very likely will be at least one of those chambers. And, honestly, Democrats and President Biden have been able to do so little thanks to Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin anyway, supposedly Democratic senators who won't allow any necessary reforms. So, the country's going to basically stay broken. The MAGA people and the quote, stop the steal people, the Trump true believers, they're going to continue to push the big lie that the 2020 election was supposedly stolen from them. And of course, what they're doing with that is simply saying that they don't recognize the legitimacy of Democrats being in power ever at all. Right. And they're at this point, in many cases, openly talking about civil war or about simply not wanting to have democracy at all. But I expect that while American democracy will continue to become even less democratic than it already is, we'll still have the forms, we'll still have elections. They just won't do much good for anyone. It's very likely in June that Roe v. Wade will actually be outright overturned. I don't think Chief Justice Roberts would be for that. I think he would be for keeping it on paper, but weakening it to the point where it is meaningless, and it's almost meaningless already. But the way the Supreme Court has been going, the other 5 radical right-wing justices, they don't need Roberts to just take Roe off the books. And that's very dangerous. I mean, and not even just for abortion and the, millions of women and people who can get pregnant, that will put at risk, and at risk of a number of things. I mean, of course, there's a lot of negative consequences of having to carry unplanned pregnancies to term, and there can be huge health consequences. But also, and this is again where I think the legacy media is being extremely irresponsible. The Washington Post has published some sort of glowing, very fluffy pieces about how, women in Texas now, where there's no abortions, are founding, evangelical Christian women, of course, are founding these homes for, young unwed mothers. Yeah, we've seen that picture before. It always leads to massive abuse, physical, sometimes sexual, certainly including the coercive removal of children from mothers forced to sign papers under duress when they don't know what they're doing, for adoption by the quote right kind of good Christian quote family. So there's all kinds of abuses that are going to come out of the institutions being founded to deal with what evangelicals have long since called crisis pregnancies, with their fake crisis pregnancy centers that are used to lure people away from seeking, comprehensive family planning and women's health care. So that's bad. All that's very bad, but it gets worse because because you take you take Roe away, and then you have no constitutional basis. You have no basis in constitutional law for any recognition of a right to privacy. So that opens up a huge can of worms, right? And we can see all kinds of things go backwards if there's no right to privacy, including contraception and same-sex marriage, arguably, and perhaps even the return of state-level quote sodomy laws. If there's no right to privacy, then on what basis does the overturning of Texas sodomy laws stand?
Yeah, it's not the prettiest outlook, but it is a it is.
You overturn Roe, there's going to be a huge hating effect. I mean, Lawrence is an obvious example, but Lawrence v. Texas. But I think there are so many others. It's going to get bad.
Right. Yeah, and it's important to note, even at the tail of this conversation, is that this is the long stated goal of a lot of evangelical legal institutions that are very moneyed, that are well heeled and very deeply connected to a lot of state and federal machinery.
And they want to return us to a world where they have the paternalistic control of everything, and the ability to decide who is deserving of healthcare, and the ability to act hypocritically when they have the power and wealth to do so. So, your little sister gets pregnant. Okay, you send her off somewhere where you have the money to do so for her to get an abortion. You never speak of it again. I mean, there are evangelical families, quite a few, where that would happen. But, it should be against the law for everyone else and for everyone in general. You'll just make excuses for yourself sometimes.
Yeah.
Paternalism comes with all of that nepotism and hypocrisy and, just domination of powerful, mostly white Christian men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's why these things are so important to speak out about, and to, even if it can feel overwhelming and it's not something that you may feel that you have any direct influence over, it's important to stay informed and see,
Mm-hmm.
what you
my
might
prediction
be able
is
to do.
Everything is terrible, and it's just going to get more terrible. I've been very right with that prediction for the last few years. So
yeah, why
stop now?
Honestly, it is. Hope is a choice at this point. Hope is definitely. I think in some ways always has been. It's been a choice, and I hope that. And there are.
I feel you in my head, Charles. What are you looking for in there?
There's. And to clue the listener in on there, we have a long running joke that Chrissy is Magneto and I'm Professor X in our relationship, and the sort of the different poles that we represent. To use a so yeah, I try to be that, if not optimistic, at least leaning into the potentiality of optimism. And if you Chrissy, on the note of just nerdy X-Men talk for 1 second, that over the last couple of years, there's been this incredible renaissance of X-Men comics, and basically within the sort of new status quo of the X-Men books, all of the mutants live. There's a mutant nation, and like Magneto and Professor X essentially co-founded the nation with some other groups, and they work together basically to protect the interests of mutants.
Mhm.
So
it's a nice idea.
yeah, it's a very good metaphor. Still works. It's amazing how that still feels relevant even after.
Although I do love how Deadpool always makes fun of it though.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Breaking the fourth wall and calling X-Men an outdated metaphor for racism, and always talking about how much he hates Wolverine. It's hilarious. But anyway,
I mean, Marvel is publishing X-Men books where Wolverine, Cyclops, and Jean Grey are in a triad. So I mean, things are different over there now than they used to be. That's my own.
Start reading comics.
That's my own rabbit hole. There is comic books. Anyways, thank you so much, Chrissy, for joining me and sort of talking about where things have gone over the last year, where they may be going. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Where can people find your work online and support your work?
Thanks for having me, Blake. As you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I write primarily for Religion Dispatches and Open Democracy these days. Sometimes I also write for The Conversationalist, Dame Magazine, and other outlets. You can find me on Twitter at C_Stroop. That's STROOP. And if you're interested in the stories of people who have deconstructed conservative Christianity, check out my co-edited anthology with Lauren O'Neill, Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. Should be able to order that wherever you order books. So, Lauren and I certainly encourage the use of independent bookstores, or if you're, anti-Amazon, you don't have to get it there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great collection of essays. You can also find my interview with Chrissy and Lauren in the archive of the show. So just scroll back.
That was a fun one.
Yeah.
I hope you had as much fun as I did.
No, it was definitely fun. So as always, you can follow me on Twitter at BRChastain, and you can support my work at the Post-Evangelical Post, which is hosted on Substack. I've sort of hacked Substack so you can support it at $4, $6, or $8 a month. You can follow those links at postevangelicalpost.com. Thank you very much for listening.